September 2nd, 1945. 3 days after Japan's formal surrender aboard the USS Missouri, Captain William Hargrove of the 11th Airborne Division stood in the humid afternoon air outside Sugamo Prison in Tokyo, watching Japanese guards file out with their hands raised. The war was over. Everyone kept saying that. But as Hargrove studied the massive concrete structure before him, its windows like dark, hollow eyes, he felt something was just beginning. "Sir, the translators are here," said Sergeant James Kovac, a Chicago-born Nisei whose Japanese language skills had made him invaluable during the occupation. Kovac's face was unreadable, but Hargrove had learned to recognize tension in his interpreter's shoulders. The prison was supposed to be empty of political prisoners. The Japanese government had assured MacArthur's headquarters that all POWs and civilians had been released before surrender, but intelligence reports suggested otherwise. Whispers from liberated Allied prisoners spoke of a place they called the Silent Wing, a section of Sugamo where people entered but never left. Before we jump back in, tell us where you're tuning in from, and if this story touches you, make sure you're subscribed, because tomorrow I've saved something extra special for you. Hargrove's orders were simple. Catalog the facility, document any remaining prisoners, and prepare for war crimes investigations. Simple, bureaucratic. The kind of assignment that suggested headquarters wanted him out of the way while real soldiers enjoyed the victory celebrations. As they entered the main corridor, the smell hit them first. Not death. Hargrove had smelled enough death in the Philippines and Okinawa to recognize it immediately. This was different. Antiseptic, chemical, medical. But underneath it, something else. Something that made his stomach tighten. The Japanese administrator who met them was a small, nervous man named Tanaka, who kept his eyes fixed on the floor. Through Kovac, he explained the prison layout, his words coming quickly, too quickly, like a man eager to finish an unpleasant task and be gone. "He says the main cell blocks were evacuated August 10th, Kovacs translated. Political prisoners released, common criminals transferred to other facilities." "And the Silent Wing?" Hargrove asked directly, watching Tanaka's face. The administrator's expression didn't change, but his hands trembled slightly. Kovac pressed him in rapid Japanese. The exchange grew heated. Finally, Kovac turned to Hargrove, his face pale. "He says there is no Silent Wing, says we must be thinking of a different facility." Hargrove pulled out a folder containing statements from 3 different Allied POWs, each independently mentioning Sugamo's sealed western section. He placed it on the desk between them without opening it. "Tell him we're going to search every inch of this prison. Tell him it'll go easier for everyone if he cooperates now." Tanaka stared at the folder for a long moment. When he finally spoke, his voice was barely audible. "He says he'll take us there, but he says, sir, he says we won't believe what we find. He says nobody ever does." They followed Tanaka through corridors that grew progressively darker and more isolated. The sounds of occupation, American soldiers' voices, vehicle engines, the bustle of a defeated city learning to function under foreign control, faded behind them. Their footsteps echoed on concrete floors that seemed to stretch endlessly. At the western terminus, they reached a steel door unlike any other in the facility. It was reinforced, the kind designed to contain explosions from within. A Japanese character was stenciled on its surface in white paint. "What does it say?" Hargrove asked. Kovac hesitated. "Restricted." "But the character used, it's not the standard one. It's archaic. It implies something forbidden, not just prohibited." Tanaka produced a key from a chain around his neck. His hands shook so badly that Kovac had to help him fit it into the lock. The door opened with a sound like a sigh, releasing air that had been sealed inside for God knows how long. Beyond lay darkness and a staircase leading down. "The silent wing is underground," Kovac said quietly. He says it was built in 1933, extended in 1937, expanded again in 1942. 12 years of construction, 12 years of whatever lay below. Hargrove clicked on his flashlight. The beam revealed stairs descending at least 50 feet. The walls were concrete, lined with pipes and electrical conduits that suggested sophisticated infrastructure. This wasn't a simple cell block. This was a facility designed for a specific purpose. They descended in silence, their shadows dancing on the walls. At the bottom, another corridor stretched before them, this one lined with doors, dozens of them, perhaps 100, each with a small viewing slot and a numbering system in Japanese characters. "Check the first one," Hargrove ordered. Kovac slid back the viewing slot on cell 1. He looked inside for 3 seconds before his flashlight clattered to the floor. "Sir," Kovac's voice broke. "Sir, you need to see this." What Hargrove saw through that viewing slot would haunt him for the rest of his life. The cell was perhaps 8 feet square. Its walls were covered in writing, thousands upon thousands of characters scratched into the concrete with fingernails, with bits of metal, with anything that could leave a mark. The writing covered every surface from floor to ceiling, layers upon layers, some characters carved over older ones, creating a palimpsest of desperation. But it was the dates that made Hargrove's blood run cold. Kovac was translating in a mechanical voice, as if the only way to process what he was seeing was to drain it of all emotion. "This one's from 1934. This is 1937, 1940, 1942. Sir, these go back over a decade." The cell was empty now, but the evidence of its occupation was undeniable. A sleeping mat, rotted with age and use, a wooden bucket, its purpose obvious. And on one wall, separate from the chronological record, a single phrase repeated hundreds of times in increasingly shaky handwriting. "I existed. Remember me. I existed." They moved to the next cell, and the next. Each told the same story: prolonged isolation, years-long confinement, the slow deterioration of human consciousness captured in writing that became progressively less coherent. Some cells contained poems, others mathematical calculations, as if the inmates were trying to hold on to sanity through pure logic. One cell had a calendar scratched into the wall, each day marked off. The marks numbered 3,847 days, over 10 years. "What is this place?" Hargrove whispered, though he was beginning to understand. Tanaka spoke without prompting now, the words pouring out as if he'd been waiting years to confess. Kovac translated mechanically. "It's called the Department of Thought Examination. Toko, the special higher police, used it for political dissidents, communists, socialists, peace activists, Christians who refused to renounce their faith, intellectuals who questioned government policy, even some military officers who advocated ending the war." "How many?" Hargrove asked. He doesn't know the exact number. The records were burned 3 weeks ago, but the wing has 127 cells. Most were continuously occupied since construction. The math was horrifying. 127 cells times 12 years meant potentially thousands of prisoners cycled through this underground hell, each spending years in isolation, their existence known only to their captors. "Where are they now?" Hargrove demanded. "The prisoners, where are they?" Tanaka's answer, delivered in barely audible Japanese, made Kovac close his eyes. "He says most died in custody. The bodies were cremated and the ashes disposed of, but he says approximately 40 prisoners were still here on August 10th, when the decision was made to evacuate the facility before surrender." "What happened to them?" "He says he doesn't know.
He says Special Police Colonel Masahiro Nakamura ordered them removed. He won't say where. Hargrove grabbed Tanaka by his uniform jacket, spinning him around. I don't care what you've been told. I don't care what threats you've received. You will tell me what happened to those 40 people, or I swear to God. Captain! Kovac's shout cut through Hargrove's fury. The sergeant was at the end of the corridor, in front of a door different from the others. This one was larger, with a window made of thick glass. Hargrove released Tanaka and moved quickly to where Kovac stood. Through the window, he could see a room perhaps 30 feet square. Unlike the cells, this space was well lit by overhead fixtures, the bulbs still burning. It was arranged like a medical examination room, with tables, sinks, and cabinets full of instruments. But it was what lay on the tables that made Hargrove's hand instinctively reach for his service pistol. Files, mountains of files, hundreds, perhaps thousands of folders, each meticulously labeled, each containing what appeared to be detailed documentation. He says this is the records room, Kovacs translated. Everything was supposed to be destroyed, but Colonel Masahiro Nakamura disappeared on August 12th. Without his authorization, the junior officers were too afraid to burn the files. Hargrove tried the door, locked. He stepped back and kicked it hard, once, twice. On the third kick, the lock shattered, and the door swung open. The files were organized by year and category. Hargrove pulled one at random from a 1938 batch. Even without reading Japanese, the contents were clear. Photographs of an emaciated man in progressive stages of deterioration, medical notations, psychological evaluations, interrogation transcripts. Kovacs picked up another file, this one from 1941. He opened it, scanned the first page, and went completely still. "What is it?" Hargrove asked. "This prisoner, Takeshi Yamamoto, age 34, university professor, arrested in December 1940 for giving a lecture suggesting that war with America would be catastrophic for Japan, subjected to intensive re-education, confined to cell 47 for 892 days, interrogated 217 times, subjected to—" He stopped, unable to continue. "Subjected to what, Sergeant?" "Water torture, electric shock, extended stress positions, sleep deprivation for periods up to 8 days, and something they call psychological adjustment therapy." He looked up from the file. "Sir, that's just one case. There are thousands of files here." Hargrove moved systematically through the cabinets, pulling samples from different years. The pattern was consistent. Political dissidents arrested for thought crimes, subjected to years of isolation and systematic torture designed not to extract information, but to break their minds, to remake their thinking. This wasn't intelligence gathering. This was an industrial-scale program of psychological destruction. And then Hargrove found the section labeled August 45. There were 42 files, updated through August 9th. Each contained recent photographs. Hargrove spread them across the table. 42 faces stared up at him, men and women, ranging from teenagers to the elderly, all showing the distinctive hollowed-eyed look of prolonged isolation and malnutrition. But they were alive on August 9th, 5 days before surrender. "Tanaka," Hargrove said, his voice deadly quiet. "Last chance? What happened to these people?" The administrator was crying now, shoulders shaking. He spoke rapidly in Japanese, the words tumbling over each other. Kovacs listened, his face growing progressively more horrified. He says on the night of August 10th, after the Emperor's surrender broadcast, Colonel Masahiro Nakamura ordered the remaining prisoners prepared for evacuation. They were told they were being transferred to another facility. They were given their personal effects, such as they were. They were loaded into trucks. Nakamura himself led the convoy. Where did they go? He says the trucks went north, toward the mountains. He says Nakamura had mentioned a mine shaft, an old copper mine, abandoned since the 1920s. He says Nakamura told his subordinates that there could be no evidence, no witnesses, that Japan's honor depended on the truth never being revealed.
Within 2 hours, Hargrove had assembled a convoy of his own. 3 jeeps, 2 trucks with squads of infantry, and a medical unit with 2 doctors and 4 corpsmen. He'd radioed his findings directly to 8th Army headquarters, bypassing his immediate superiors. The response had been immediate. Locate the prisoners, recover any survivors, and secure all evidence. Major David Chen from the Judge Advocate General's office had been attached to the mission, a Chinese-American lawyer from San Francisco who specialized in war crimes documentation. He sat beside Hargrove in the lead jeep, studying the maps Tanaka had provided with a flashlight as they raced through the dark Japanese countryside. "This mine is approximately 40 miles northeast of Tokyo," Chen said. "According to the prison administrator, it's in a remote valley that was primarily used for copper extraction until economic collapse in the 1920s. After that, it was abandoned. No nearby villages, no reason for anyone to go there." "Perfect place to hide a massacre," Hargrove said grimly. The roads deteriorated as they climbed into the mountains. What had started as paved highways gave way to gravel, then to dirt tracks barely wide enough for their vehicles. The September night was cool at this altitude, and mist gathered in the valleys like ghostly rivers. Kovac rode in the second jeep with 2 other Nisei translators. They'd brought along 3 Japanese policemen from the Occupation Authority, men who had no connection to the Toko and who had been vetted as opponents of the secret police. If they found survivors, they would need help communicating, establishing trust. At 0300 hours, they reached a point where the road simply ended. Before them, a narrow trail wound upward into dense forest. "We proceed on foot from here," Hargrove ordered. "Combat formation. I want flankers out. Nobody fires unless I give the order. We don't know what we're walking into." The men moved with practiced efficiency, their training from months of combat in the Pacific taking over. They advanced through the forest in silence, weapons ready, every sense alert. The mist grew thicker as they climbed, reducing visibility to perhaps 20 feet. After 40 minutes of hiking, Sergeant Miller, one of the point men, raised his fist, the signal to halt. Hargrove moved forward carefully until he reached Miller's position. The sergeant pointed ahead without speaking. Through gaps in the mist, Hargrove could see vehicles. 2 trucks parked in a small clearing, their canvas covers sagging with moisture. Beyond them, barely visible, the dark mouth of a mine shaft gaped in the hillside like a wound. "No movement, sir. But, sir, smell that." Hargrove inhaled. Beneath the scent of earth and vegetation, there was something else. Decay. Death. The sweet, sick smell that every combat soldier learned to recognize. "Spread out," Hargrove ordered quietly. "Surround the clearing. Chen, Kovac, with me. Medical team, stand ready." They approached the trucks first. The vehicles were military issue, recently used. The engines were still faintly warm to the touch despite hours in the mountain cold. In the back of one truck, they found wooden crates marked with Japanese characters. "Explosives, dynamite, and blasting caps," Kovac translated. The mine entrance was reinforced with old timber supports that showed signs of recent disturbance. Fresh tool marks on the wood, disturbed earth around the opening, and something else. Scratches in the dirt as if something had been dragged inside. Hargrove clicked on his flashlight, the beam penetrating perhaps 30 feet into the darkness before being swallowed. The mine sloped downward at a steep angle, its walls shored up with rotting timbers that creaked ominously. "Sir," one of the medical corpsmen called out. He was kneeling near the mine entrance, examining something. "You need to see this." It was a shoe. A woman's shoe, simple canvas, worn through at the sole, and next to it, a small pool of dried blood. "They went in there," Hargrove said. "The question is, did they come out?" Major Chen was examining the explosives more closely. "Captain, these crates have been opened. Half the dynamite is missing." The implication was clear. If Nakamura had brought prisoners here to execute them and hide the evidence, he would have used the explosives to collapse the mine shaft, sealing them inside forever. "We're going in," Hargrove decided. "Miller, take 4 men and secure this perimeter. Nobody leaves without my authorization. If any Japanese military personnel show up, detain them. If they resist, you have my authorization to use force." "Sir, the structural integrity of that mine," Chen began, "is irrelevant. We came here to find those prisoners. I don't care if that shaft is held up with toothpicks and prayers, we're going in." They organized quickly. 6 soldiers, plus Hargrove, Kovac, Chen, and 2 corpsmen. Everyone carried flashlights, rope, and emergency supplies.
One soldier, Private Daniels, had mining experience from West Virginia coal country. He examined the tunnel entrance with a professional eye. The main shaft looks stable enough for the first 100 feet, he assessed. But sir, if they used explosives further in, we could be walking into a collapse zone. One wrong step and we could bring the whole thing down on top of us. Noted. Let's move. The mine swallowed them immediately. Within 20 feet, the night disappeared and they were in absolute darkness broken only by their flashlight beams. The air was cool and damp, heavy with the scent of earth and rot. Water dripped from the ceiling, each drop echoing in the confined space. The main shaft descended at perhaps 20 degrees angle, reinforced every 10 feet with timber supports that groaned under the weight of the mountain above. Side tunnels branched off at irregular intervals, dark openings that led to collapsed sections or deeper shafts. They found the first body at approximately 200 feet down. He was an elderly man, probably in his 70s, dressed in the simple cotton clothing of a prisoner. He'd been shot once in the back of the head. The body had been pushed against the wall, partially covered with loose rock and debris, but rats had been added. "Check for identification," Hargrove ordered, his voice steady despite the rage building inside him. Kovac searched the body carefully, finding a small cloth bag tied around the man's neck. Inside was a scrap of paper with Japanese writing and a faded photograph of a young couple. His name was Hiroshi Suzuki, Kovac read, age 73, former university chancellor, arrested in 1938 for publishing an editorial opposing military expansion in China. The photograph shows him and his wife on their wedding day, 1895. They marked the location and moved deeper. The second body was a woman in her 40s, same execution style. Same crude attempt at burial. She'd been carrying a small bound journal, its pages filled with cramped handwriting. "Poetry," Kovac said, his voice thick. "Written during her imprisonment. This one's dated August 8th, 2 days before the surrender. It's about cherry blossoms and her daughter." 3 more bodies in the next 100 feet. All executed, all partially buried. The mine shaft was becoming a mass grave. But something was wrong. They'd found 5 bodies. Tanaka said 42 prisoners were removed from Sugamo. "Where are the rest?" Chen whispered. Private Daniels, who'd been examining the tunnel walls, called out, "Sir, the shaft branches ahead, 2 directions, and I can see blast residue on the walls. They used explosives down here." The left branch showed clear signs of a controlled collapse. The entrance was partially blocked with rubble, but not completely sealed. Through gaps in the debris, Hargrove could see that the tunnel continued beyond, but it would require clearing the obstruction to proceed. The right branch was open, descending even steeper into darkness. Hargrove made the decision quickly. "Daniels, take 3 men and start clearing that left branch. Carefully. Don't bring down any more rock. The rest of us continue right. Kovac, mark this junction clearly. If we have to retreat, I want to know the way out." They descended the right branch, their flashlight beams revealing more disturbing evidence. Bloodstains on the walls, bullet casings scattered on the ground, and writing. Someone had scratched a message on the tunnel wall in Japanese characters. "They told us we were being freed," Kovac translated. "We believed them until we saw the mine. Some tried to run. They were shot. The colonel is making us walk deeper. There is no freedom here, only darkness." Hargrove felt his jaw clench. He'd seen atrocities in the Pacific, the aftermath of Bataan, the horrors of Japanese POW camps. But this was different. This was the systematic murder of Japan's own citizens, executed in the final days of the war to hide evidence of a domestic terror campaign. The tunnel leveled out approximately 500 feet down, opening into a larger chamber, probably an old ore collection point. The space was perhaps 40 feet across, with a ceiling barely high enough to stand upright. Multiple tunnels branched off in different directions. And in the center of the chamber were the bodies. Not 5, not 10. Dozens of them, piled haphazardly, some showing signs of execution, others of what looked like systematic beating. They'd been covered with a layer of dirt and rock, but the job had been done hastily, incompletely. The medical corps men moved forward, checking for any signs of life, even though it was obvious these people had been dead for days. Hargrove stood frozen, his flashlight being moving slowly across the carnage, counting. 28 bodies, Chen said quietly, his lawyer's precision asserting itself even in this horror. We're still missing at least 14 from Tanaka's count. A sound echoed from one of the side tunnels, a faint scraping, like rock sliding on rock. Every weapon came up instantly, all flashlights converging on the tunnel entrance. "Who's there?" Hargrove shouted in English, then nodded to Kovac, who repeated it in Japanese. For a long moment, nothing. Then a voice, weak and cracked from disuse, speaking rapid Japanese. Kovac called back, his tone gentle, reassuring. Another exchange. Then he turned to Hargrove. "Sir, there are survivors. They've been hiding deeper in the mine since the massacre. They think we're Nakawara's men returning to finish the job."
Hargrove lowered his weapon immediately. "Tell them we're American soldiers. Tell them the war is over. Tell them they're safe now." The exchange continued, Kovac's voice echoing in the confined space. Hargrove could hear the desperation in his translator's tone as he tried to convince the hidden survivors that this wasn't a trap. Finally, movement in the darkness. A figure emerged slowly, hands raised, blinking against the flashlight beams. It was a man, perhaps 50 years old, though his condition made it hard to judge. His face was gaunt, his clothing torn and filthy. But his eyes burned with intelligence and profound wariness. He spoke rapidly to Kovac, never taking his gaze from the American soldiers. "His name is Dr. Kenji Watanabe," Kovac translated. "He's a physician who was arrested in 1942 for treating wounded Chinese civilians during the Shanghai campaign. He says there are 13 others hiding in the side tunnel. They've been there for 5 days, since the night of the massacre." "Tell them to bring them out," Hargrove said. "Tell them we have medical supplies, food and water. Tell them we're here to help." It took another 10 minutes of careful negotiation before the survivors emerged. 13 souls, ranging from a girl who couldn't have been more than 16 to an old woman who could barely walk. All showed signs of prolonged imprisonment, the distinctive hollow-eyed look, the pallor of people who hadn't seen sunlight in years, the careful movements of those who'd learned to conserve every ounce of energy. The medical corpsmen moved immediately to help, offering water and emergency rations, but several of the survivors recoiled, as if expecting the kindness to be a prelude to violence. Dr. Watanabe spoke again, his voice stronger now, and Kovac began translating continuously as the physician told their story. They'd been removed from Sugamo on the night of August 10th, told they were being transferred to a facility in the countryside, where they would eventually be released as part of the surrender agreement. The lie had been maintained until the trucks reached the mine. Then Colonel Nakamura had shown his true intentions. The prisoners had been forced from the trucks at gunpoint and marched into the mine. They'd understood then what was happening, but resistance was impossible. They were weakened from years of imprisonment, facing armed and healthy soldiers. Some had tried to run anyway and were shot immediately. In the mine chamber, Nakamura had delivered what he clearly considered a justified speech. He'd spoken of Japan's honor, of the shame that would come if the world learned about the Thought Police's activities, of the necessity of their sacrifice for the greater good of the nation. Then the executions had begun. "He shot them himself," Dr. Watanabe said through Kovac, "one by one, standing them against the wall and shooting them in the head. He made the rest of us watch. He said we needed to understand why this was necessary. He said we were enemies of Japan who had betrayed our country by thinking incorrect thoughts, and that our deaths would purify the nation." 28 people had died this way, executed methodically over the course of several hours. The remaining 14, those who'd survived, had only done so because of a combination of desperation and fortune. When there were about 20 of us left, the colonel ordered his men to set the demolition charges. They were going to collapse the entire section, bury all the evidence. But while they were placing the explosives in the other tunnels, I noticed something. This side tunnel behind us, it wasn't blocked. It led deeper into the mine.
The survivors had made a desperate decision. While Nakamura and his men were focused on setting charges in the main chamber, the 14 had slipped one by one into the side tunnel, disappearing into the darkness. They knew they were essentially trapping themselves, that they had no light, no supplies, no way out. But it was death in the darkness, or death by bullet. "We heard the explosions," Watanabe said. "We felt the mine shake. We thought the entire structure would collapse on us. But this section was deeper, older, more stable. We survived the blast. But then we were trapped with no food, no water, no light, and no way to know if we'd been completely buried." They'd existed in total darkness for 5 days. The only water had come from moisture seeping through the rocks, collected by cupping their hands against the walls. They had no food at all. Several had wanted to try to dig out, but Dr. Watanabe had convinced them to wait, to conserve their strength. He'd reasoned that the Allied occupation forces would investigate Sugamo, would find the records, would come looking. "I didn't really believe it," Watanabe admitted. "I thought we would die here, in the dark, slowly starving, but I couldn't let them know I'd lost hope. A doctor's duty is to keep their patients alive even when there's no medical treatment to offer. Sometimes hope is the only medicine we have." Preparing and narrating this story took us a lot of time, so if you are enjoying it, subscribe to our channel. It means a lot to us. Now, back to the story. Major Chen was documenting everything, his notebook filling with testimony. The survivors spoke in turns now, each adding their piece to the picture. They'd heard the trucks return at some point, probably Nakamura's men coming back to check that the mine was properly sealed. They'd heard voices, Japanese voices, discussing whether they needed to set more charges. Then the trucks had driven away. "We waited another day after that before attempting to move," said a younger man who identified himself as Takeshi Ito, a former university student arrested for organizing a peace discussion group. "We knew the main chamber was collapsed, but we thought, perhaps, there might be another way out through the side tunnels. In the complete darkness, we couldn't see anything, so we had to feel our way along the walls." "That's how we found the bodies," added the teenage girl, who gave her name as Yuki Matsuda. She'd been arrested at 15 for possessing a banned book. "We stumbled over them in the dark. We knew they were our friends, people we'd been imprisoned with for years. We couldn't even see their faces to say goodbye." Her voice cracked as she continued. "There was a woman named Hannah. She used to tap messages to me through the wall of my cell in Sugamo. Morse code, she'd learned somehow. She'd tap poems, jokes, anything to remind me I wasn't alone. In the mine, before the shooting started, she held my hand. She told me to be brave, that whatever happened, at least we'd die free from the cells." Yuki wiped her eyes. "When we were hiding in the tunnel and heard the explosions, I kept thinking about her. When we found the bodies later, I touched each one, trying to recognize them by their clothing, their size. I found her. I stayed with her in the darkness for a while, just sitting there. I told her thank you. Thank you for the poems. Thank you for helping me survive 3 years in that cell. I said goodbye." The old woman, who introduced herself as Fumiko Hayashi, had been a school teacher arrested for refusing to teach the government-mandated propaganda curriculum. She spoke in a whisper, her voice damaged by years of shouting for help that never came. "In the darkness, we couldn't tell day from night. Time stopped meaning anything. Some of us started to hallucinate from dehydration and hunger. We saw lights that weren't there. We heard voices calling us. One man became convinced his dead mother was leading him to an exit. He wandered off into one of the side tunnels. We heard him calling out, further and further away, until his voice faded completely. We never saw him again." "So there were 14 of you, initially?" Chen asked gently. Dr. Watanabe nodded grimly. 14 of us escaped into the tunnel. One was lost to the darkness and his own mind. 13 of us you found." As the corpsmen completed their medical assessments, Private Daniels approached Hargrove with a discovery that added another layer of horror to the scene. He'd been exploring the collapsed sections and found something disturbing. "Sir, the demolition charges were set professionally. Precise placement to create a controlled collapse that would seal the main chamber without bringing down the entire mine system. Whoever set these charges knew exactly what they were doing." "Meaning?" Hargrove asked, though he suspected the answer. "Meaning Nakamura didn't just want to kill these people and hide the bodies. He wanted to preserve the mine structure itself, maybe so it could be used again later, maybe so the collapse would look natural if anyone ever investigated. This wasn't a panicked cover-up, sir. This was a carefully planned execution and burial." The calculation of it, the cold precision, made Hargrove's stomach turn. This hadn't been a wartime atrocity committed in the heat of battle or under the pressure of combat. This had been bureaucratic murder, carried out with the same attention to detail that might be applied to any other administrative task. The survivors were finally ready to move. The medical team had stabilized everyone enough for the journey, although the old woman would need to be carried on a stretcher. As they prepared to leave the death chamber, Dr. Watanabe asked for a moment. He moved to where the bodies lay, kneeling carefully despite his weakened condition. He spoke in Japanese, a prayer or benediction, his hands pressed together. The other survivors joined him, forming a circle around their dead companions. Kovac translated quietly for the Americans. He's saying their names, all 28 of them. He's telling them they'll be remembered, that their deaths won't be hidden, that the world will know what happened here. When the prayer ended, Dr. Watanabe looked up at Hargrove. "Captain, I must ask something of you. These people must have proper burial, with their names, with dignity, not left in this hole like discarded refuse. Can you promise me that?" "You have my word, Doctor. Every one of them will be identified, properly buried, and their families notified. I'll see to it personally." The climb out of the mine took nearly 2 hours. The survivors moved slowly, their bodies pushed beyond endurance by years of imprisonment followed by 5 days of starvation. Several had to stop repeatedly to rest. The teenage girl, Yuki, had to be supported by 2 soldiers, her legs giving out repeatedly on the steep incline. But as they climbed, something remarkable happened. The survivors began to sing. It started with Dr. Watanabe, his voice cracked but steady, singing what Kovac identified as a traditional Japanese folk song about cherry blossoms in spring. One by one, the other survivors joined in, their voices blending in the darkness of the tunnel. "Why are they singing?" one of the American soldiers asked, bewildered. Kovac listened for a moment, then explained. "It's a song about renewal, about beauty returning after winter, about life continuing despite hardship. They're singing because they can. Because in the cells, singing was forbidden. Because in the darkness of the tunnel, they had no voice. They're singing because they're free." When they finally emerged into the pre-dawn air, the singing stopped abruptly. Several survivors simply collapsed, overwhelmed by the sensation of open space after years of confinement. Yuki stood perfectly still, her face tilted toward the sky where the first hints of dawn were breaking through the clouds. "Colors," she whispered in Japanese. Kovac translated. "She says she had forgotten there were colors. In the cell, everything was gray. She's seeing the blue of the sky, the green of the trees. She says it's the most beautiful thing she's ever seen." The old teacher, Fumiko, was crying silently, tears streaming down her weathered cheeks. When asked if she was in pain, she shook her head. Through Kovac, she explained, "These are not tears of pain. These are tears of gratitude. I thought I would die in darkness, forgotten by the world, but I'm standing under the open sky. I'm breathing free air. I'm alive. How can I not weep with joy?" As the medical teams loaded the survivors into the trucks for transport to Tokyo, Hargrove took a final look at the mine entrance. Somewhere in that darkness lay 28 bodies, victims of a crime that should never have happened. But 13 living witnesses were leaving with him. 13 people who would ensure the truth came out. Sergeant Miller approached Hargrove with an expression troubled. "Sir, what kind of man does something like this? Executes his own people, buries them in a mine, all to hide political opinions?" Hargrove thought about Nakamura's calculated brutality, about the files documenting 12 years of systematic torture, about a government program designed to eliminate free thought. "The kind of man who believes ideas are more dangerous than bullets, Sergeant. The kind who thinks uniformity of thought is more important than human life. The kind we need to make sure never holds power again." As the convoy prepared to depart, Dr. Watanabe called Hargrove over to his truck. Despite his exhaustion, despite everything he'd endured, the physician's eyes were clear and focused. "Captain, I need you to understand something. What happened to us, the imprisonment, the torture, the attempted murder, it wasn't the work of one evil man. It was a system. There were administrators who processed our arrests, guards who maintained the cells, interrogators who conducted the torture, bureaucrats who allocated the budget, judges who legalized it, and politicians who looked away because it was convenient. Nakamura pulled the trigger, but hundreds of people loaded the gun. When you investigate this, when you seek justice, remember that. The crime wasn't just in the mine. The crime was in every office, every courtroom, every government building where someone decided that controlling thought was more important than preserving life." Hargrove nodded slowly. "We'll find them all, Doctor. Everyone involved. I promise you that." "Good. Because if you only punish the trigger man, the system that created him remains intact, ready to do it again when circumstances permit. Justice requires dismantling the entire apparatus, not just cutting off its most visible manifestation." As the trucks rolled down the mountain road towards Tokyo, the sun rose fully over Japan. In the back of the lead truck, 13 survivors watched the landscape pass. Rice paddies, villages, ordinary people beginning their daily routines in a defeated nation learning to function under occupation. They were free. Against all odds, despite everything designed to destroy them, they had survived. And they carried with them the truth that would help prevent such horrors from happening again. But they also carried the weight of 28 who hadn't survived, and the thousands more who died in the silent wings across Japan over 12 years of political repression. Their freedom came with an obligation: to remember, to testify, to ensure that those deaths meant something. Dr. Watanabe looked at his fellow survivors, seeing in their faces the same determination he felt. They'd been broken in those cells, tortured in those interrogation rooms, nearly murdered in that mine. But they survived. And survival, they were all beginning to understand, was just the beginning of their real work. The work of bearing witness, the work of demanding accountability, the work of transforming their suffering into a lesson that might, just might, help prevent the next generation from having to learn it the hard way.
The convoy returned to Tokyo as the sun rose over a defeated nation. In the back of the medical trucks, the 13 survivors lay on stretchers, receiving IV fluids and emergency care. Dr. Watanabe refused to lie down, sitting upright despite the doctor's protests, watching through the canvas opening as if afraid the freedom might disappear if he closed his eyes. Hargrove had radioed ahead with a preliminary report. The response from 8th Army headquarters had been immediate and electric. By the time they reached the outskirts of Tokyo, a full colonel from MacArthur's staff was waiting at the medical facility, along with a team of investigators from the War Crimes Commission. Colonel Richard Thornton was a career officer who'd spent the war in staff positions, and his pristine uniform contrasted sharply with Hargrove's mud-stained fatigues. But there was nothing soft in Thornton's eyes as he read through the initial reports. "This is bigger than we thought," Thornton said, pulling Hargrove aside as the survivors were carried into the hospital. "We've been investigating the Kempeitai, the military police, for conventional war crimes, torture of POWs, execution of captured airmen, that sort of thing. But this thought police operation? Captain, do you understand what you've uncovered? A domestic terror campaign that lasted over a decade,"
Hargrove said flatly. More than that, you've uncovered evidence that Japan's civilian government ran a systematic program to eliminate political opposition through psychological torture and murder. This wasn't military excess during wartime. This was state policy targeting Japanese citizens for having the wrong opinions. Thornton paused. The implications for the occupation are enormous. MacArthur wants every person involved identified and prosecuted. This needs to be handled carefully. Over the next week, as the survivors recovered in the hospital, a clearer picture emerged. Major Chen led the investigation, working with Japanese police who deposed the Toko and with the survivors themselves to piece together the scope of the program. The files recovered from Sugamo Prison were devastating. Over 3,000 documented cases of political prisoners held in the silent wing alone. Medical records showing systematic torture. Psychological evaluations charting the deliberate destruction of human minds. Financial records showing the budget allocated to the program. Millions of yen diverted from the war effort to fund the imprisonment and torture of Japan's own citizens. We are finding similar facilities in other cities, Chen reported at a briefing 3 days after the mine rescue. Osaka had one, Kyoto, Nagasaki, though that one was destroyed in the atomic bombing. Conservative estimate, 15,000 to 20,000 political prisoners cycled through these facilities over 12 years. Most never survived to see liberation. The survivors from the mine were providing crucial testimony. Despite their ordeal, they were determined to ensure that what had happened to them, and to the thousands who didn't survive, would be fully documented. Dr. Watanabe proved to be an invaluable witness. His medical training and his years of observation had given him detailed knowledge of the thought police's methods. He'd kept a mental catalog of every prisoner he'd encountered in Sugamo, every guard he'd observed, every detail of the torture program. The goal was never to extract information, he explained during one interview session, speaking through Kovac while Chen took notes. It was to break us, to destroy our ability to think independently. They called it thought reformation. The isolation, the interrogations, the torture, it was all designed to make us reject our own beliefs, to internalize their ideology. "How did you resist?" Chen asked. Watanabe smiled grimly. "I didn't resist. Not really. You can't resist for years. The human mind isn't designed for that. What I did was survive. I focused on small things, memorizing medical texts, reciting poetry, keeping track of time. I told myself stories about my patients, remembered their faces. I held on to my identity by remembering who I'd been before they arrested me." The young woman, Yuki Matsuda, provided testimony that shook even hardened investigators. She'd been 15 when arrested for possessing a translation of American literature her teacher had given her. She'd spent 3 years in the silent wing, from age 15 to 18, emerging as a young woman who'd spent her entire adolescence in isolation. "I forgot what my mother's voice sounded like," she said softly. "I forgot colors. In the cell, everything was gray. For 3 years, I saw nothing but gray concrete, gray light through the cell slot, gray uniforms on the guards. When I came out of the mine and saw the green trees, I couldn't process it. My mind had forgotten that color existed." But the investigation's most urgent priority was locating Masahiro Nakamura. He was the key to connecting the Thought Police program to the higher levels of government, to understanding who had authorized and funded the operation, and to ensuring that those responsible faced justice. Japanese police, working with American investigators, tracked down former Toko officers. Most had destroyed their records and gone into hiding, but a few were located. Under interrogation, they provided pieces of the puzzle. Nakamura had been a true believer, a zealot convinced that Japan's strength lay in absolute ideological conformity. He'd risen through the Toko ranks through his efficiency and ruthlessness, eventually commanding the Tokyo facility. He'd personally designed many of the psychological torture techniques, studying Western psychology texts to develop methods of breaking human resistance. He believed he was saving Japan, said a former Toko lieutenant who'd decided to cooperate with the investigation. He said that weakness came from incorrect thinking, that Japan lost the war because not everyone believed with sufficient purity. He said the prisoners were a cancer that had to be cut out. The breakthrough came from an unexpected source. One of the survivors, an elderly man named Ichiro Tanaka, no relation to the prison administrator, had been a prominent journalist before his arrest. He'd maintained contacts throughout the intellectual community, a network that had survived despite the Toko's efforts to destroy it. "I may know where Nakamura is," Tanaka said during a meeting with Hargrove and Chen. "Before the war, I knew his brother, a scholar who himself was troubled by what Masahiro had become. The brother once told me that Masahiro kept a cottage in the mountains near Lake Chuzenji, a place he went to meditate and write. If Nakamura went into hiding, he might be there." The location was investigated immediately. Intelligence about the cottage checked out. Property records showed it was owned by the Nakamura family, a remote location with limited access, perfect for someone trying to avoid detection. Hargrove wanted to be part of the arrest team, but Colonel Thornton overruled him. "You've done your part, Captain. Let CIC handle the actual arrest." The Counterintelligence Corps specialized in tracking down and apprehending war criminals. But Thornton agreed to let Hargrove observe from a distance. On September 18th, 2 weeks after the mine rescue, a CIC team surrounded the mountain cottage. Through binoculars from a nearby ridge, Hargrove watched the operation unfold. The cottage was small, traditional Japanese architecture, surrounded by pine trees with a view of the lake. Smoke rose from the chimney. Someone was inside. The CIC team moved with professional precision, blocking all exits before announcing their presence. What happened next was over in seconds. A figure emerged from the cottage, a man in a simple kimono, hands raised. From this distance, Hargrove couldn't see his face, but there was something in his posture, a kind of rigid dignity, that suggested this was their target. Masahiro Nakamura didn't resist arrest. He stood calmly as he was handcuffed, showing no emotion as the charges were read to him through a translator. Only when he was being loaded into the transport vehicle did he speak, and his words were recorded by the CIC agent who'd made the arrest. "I have nothing to apologize for. I served Japan with total loyalty. History will judge me fairly, even if you cannot." The trial of Masahiro Nakamura began on October 15, 1945, in a courtroom established by the Allied Occupation Authority. Unlike the more famous Tokyo Tribunal that would try Japan's military and political leadership for war crimes, this was a special proceeding focused specifically on the thought police program. The courtroom was packed with journalists, military observers, and Japanese civilians who'd heard rumors of what had been uncovered. In the front row sat the 13 survivors from the mine, Dr. Watanabe at their center, all dressed in new clothes provided by the Occupation Authority, but still bearing the marks of their ordeal. Nakamura entered in chains, but walked with his head high. He was 52 years old, a slim man with graying hair and cold eyes that showed no remorse as they swept across the courtroom. When asked how he pleaded to charges of murder, torture, and crimes against humanity, his response was delivered in a clear, steady voice. "Not guilty. I acted in service to the Emperor and the preservation of Japan's spiritual purity." The prosecution, led by Major Chen with support from American and Allied legal experts, presented a devastating case. The files from Sugamo Prison provided documentary evidence of systematic torture and murder. The survivors provided eyewitness testimony. Even former Toko officers offered immunity in exchange
for cooperation, testified about Nakamura's direct involvement in designing and implementing the program. The evidence was so overwhelming that the trial's outcome was never in doubt. But what made it historically significant was that it provided the first comprehensive public accounting of Japan's domestic political repression program.
Japanese civilians attending the trial learned for the first time about the silent wings, the thought reformation program, the thousands of their fellow citizens who'd been disappeared for political crimes. On the fourth day of testimony, Dr. Watanabe took the stand. His testimony lasted 3 hours as he methodically detailed his own imprisonment and torture, the deaths of prisoners he'd tried to help, the systematic nature of the program, and finally, the massacre at the mine. Colonel Nakamura told us that our deaths were necessary, Dr. Watanabe said, his voice never wavering. He said that we were impurities that had to be removed so that Japan could be reborn pure after the defeat. He said our sacrifice would be honored, that future generations would understand we died for the good of the nation. But we didn't die, Colonel. 13 of us survived. And we're here to testify that what you did wasn't patriotic service, it was murder. You didn't preserve Japan's spirit, you tried to destroy it. Because Japan's true spirit isn't mindless conformity. It's the courage to think freely, to question, to seek truth even when it's dangerous. Nakamura showed no reaction during the testimony. He sat impassive, as if the proceedings were happening to someone else. His defense attorney, a Japanese lawyer who'd been assigned to the case, made a perfunctory argument about following orders and serving national security, but his heart clearly wasn't in it. When Nakamura himself took the stand, he refused to show any remorse or acknowledgement of wrongdoing. Instead, he delivered what amounted to a political manifesto, explaining his philosophy that Japan's weakness had come from ideological diversity, that strength required absolute unity of thought, that individuals had no right to opinions that contradicted state policy. These people claimed to love Japan, Nakamura said, gesturing toward the survivors, but their love was conditional. They wanted Japan to be something it wasn't. They wanted peace when the nation needed strength. They wanted freedom when the nation needed discipline. They were parasites feeding on Japan's body, weakening it from within. I eliminated parasites. That was my duty. That was my honor. If I could do it again, I would make the same choices. The only thing I regret is that we lost the war before the program could be completed. The courtroom erupted. Japanese civilians shouted in anger. Some of the survivors wept. The judge had to gavel for order repeatedly, but Nakamura sat unmoved, apparently satisfied that he'd made his position clear. The verdict came on October 24th. Guilty on all counts. The sentence, death by hanging. Nakamura received the judgment with the same cold composure he'd shown throughout the trial. As he was led from the courtroom, he stopped briefly and looked directly at the survivors. You think you've won. You think justice has been served. But ideas don't die. The principle of ideological purity, of subordinating individual thought to national necessity, that principle will survive long after I'm gone. You can hang me, but you can't hang the truth that Japan needs discipline, needs unity, needs obedience. Dr. Watanabe stood and spoke in a clear voice that carried across the silent courtroom. You're right about one thing, Colonel. Ideas don't die. But the idea that will survive isn't yours. It's ours, that human beings have the right to think freely, to question authority, to seek truth even when it's dangerous. You tried to kill that idea with torture and murder. You failed. We're still here. That idea is still alive, and it will outlive you by generations. Masahiro Nakamura was executed on December 7, 1945. 4 years to the day after Pearl Harbor, though the date was chosen by bureaucratic coincidence rather than symbolic intent. He went to his death unrepentant, refusing to see a priest or make any final statement beyond repeating that he'd served Japan faithfully. But the impact of the trial and the revelations about the Thought Police program rippled far beyond one man's execution. The Allied Occupation Authority used the evidence from Sugamo and similar facilities to justify major reforms of Japan's political system. The dismantling of the Toko was made absolute, not just the organization, but the laws that had enabled it. The Peace Preservation Law, which had criminalized dangerous thoughts since 1925, was abolished. New constitutional protections for freedom of speech and thought were implemented. More significantly, the trial forced Japan itself to confront a piece of its wartime history that many had wanted to forget. Japanese newspapers, now operating under occupation-era press freedom, published extensive accounts of the Thought Police program. Families who'd lost members to the Silent Wing finally learned what had happened. The scale of domestic repression became impossible to ignore. For Hargrove, the experience changed him in ways he couldn't fully articulate. He'd gone into the military expecting to fight external enemies. What he'd found in that mine was something different. Evidence that the enemy was often within, that the greatest threats to human dignity came not always from foreign invaders, but from governments that feared their own people's thoughts. He attended Nakamura's execution, standing as a witness alongside Major Chen and several of the survivors. As the trapdoor opened and Nakamura fell, Hargrove felt no satisfaction, only a profound sadness that it had taken so much suffering, so many deaths, to reach this moment of accountability. "Is it enough?" he asked Dr. Watanabe afterward. "Can justice for one man balance against thousands who died?" The physician considered the question carefully before answering. "Justice isn't about balance, Captain. It's about recognition. The trial recognized that what happened to us was wrong, that we mattered, that our thoughts and lives had value. Nakamura's death doesn't bring back the thousands who died, but it tells their families, tells all of Japan, tells history. This was not acceptable. This must never happen again." That recognition is what we fought for in those cells, in that mine. Not revenge, recognition that we had the right to think freely, to question, to dissent. The trial gave us that recognition. Everything else is just closing accounts. The 13 survivors from the mine each took different paths after their liberation. Yuki Matsuda, the teenage girl who'd spent her adolescence in isolation, eventually became a teacher. She dedicated her life to education, to encouraging her students to think critically and question authority. In interviews decades later, she would say that her years in the Silent Wing taught her the value of every moment of freedom, every conversation, every new idea encountered. Takeshi Ito, the university student arrested for his peace discussion group, became a journalist. He spent his career documenting human rights abuses and political repression worldwide, driven by the belief that sunlight was the best disinfectant for authoritarian excess. Dr. Kenji Watanabe returned to medicine, but with a new focus. He became one of Japan's first psychiatrists specializing in trauma, working with both atomic bomb survivors and former political prisoners. His 1952 book, The Silent Wing: Psychological Trauma and Political Repression, became foundational text in understanding the long-term effects of state-sponsored torture. "The physical wounds heal," he wrote in the book's introduction. "The body is resilient. But the psychological wounds, the damage done to a person's sense of self, their ability to trust, their fundamental security in the world, those wounds remain. They shape everything that comes after. My work is to help people integrate those wounds into their lives without being defined by them." Hargrove himself returned to the United States in 1946, when his occupation duty ended. He had been offered a promotion and a position in military intelligence, but he declined. Instead, he went home to Ohio, married his high school sweetheart, and became a high school history teacher. For 25 years, he taught American and world history to teenagers in a small Midwestern town. He rarely spoke about the war, but once each year, usually around the anniversary of the mine rescue, he would deviate from the curriculum to tell his students about what he'd found in that Japanese prison and mine shaft. "I want you to understand something," he would tell each new generation of students. "Freedom of thought isn't just a nice idea. It's not just words in the Constitution. It's something that people die for. People suffered years of torture rather than give up their right to think freely. People hid in darkness, facing death, rather than surrender their beliefs. When you complain about having to read different perspectives, when you resist thinking critically about difficult questions, when you just want someone to tell you what to think, remember those people. Remember that freedom of thought is a gift purchased with suffering. Honor that gift by using it." In 1970, on the 50th anniversary of the war's end, a group of Japanese survivors and former American servicemen organized a memorial ceremony at the mine site. The Japanese government, now democratic and reformed, had turned the location into a historic site, with a memorial listing the names of the 42 prisoners removed from Sugamo, the 28 who died, and the 14 who survived. Hargrove attended, now 53 years old, grayer, but still with the same steady bearing. Dr. Watanabe was there, 73 years old, his movements slower but his mind sharp. Yuki Matsuda brought her 2 children to show them where her mother had nearly died. 7 of the other survivors attended, representing the 9 who were still alive. They walked together into the mine, which had been partially restored and made safe for visitors. Electric lights now illuminated the tunnels where they'd once creeped in darkness. The chamber where the massacre had occurred was preserved behind glass, the bullet marks still visible on the walls and the names of the victims etched on a memorial plaque. "I used to have nightmares about this place," Yuki said softly, her children holding her hands. "The darkness, the fear, the feeling that we'd been forgotten by the entire world. But standing here now, seeing it as a memorial instead of a tomb, knowing that people will visit and remember what happened, it transforms the meaning. We weren't forgotten. We were found. And more importantly, we're remembered." That evening, survivors and veterans gathered at a nearby inn for a quiet dinner. The conversation drifted between Japanese and English, with younger people translating for those who didn't share a common language. They told stories, shared photographs, caught up on the decades that had passed. At one point, Dr. Watanabe raised his glass in a toast. "To Captain Hargrove and his soldiers who came looking for us when everyone else had given up, to Sergeant Kovac, whose voice in Japanese was the most beautiful sound I had ever heard, to all the people who believed that justice mattered even after the war had ended, and to those who didn't survive, to the thousands who died in the silent wings, to the 28 who fell in that mine. We carry their memories. We honor their sacrifice by living freely, thinking freely, speaking freely. They paid the price for these freedoms. We must never forget what that cost." Hargrove found himself deeply moved. "Doctor, I need to tell you something. When we found you in that mine, when you and the others emerged from that tunnel, I've never felt anything like that in my life. Not at the surrender ceremony, not at any victory celebration. That moment, seeing you alive, knowing we'd gotten there in time, that was the moment I understood what we'd actually been fighting for. We'd been fighting for the idea that human beings matter, that governments exist to serve people, not the other way around, that no ideology, no national emergency, no political expediency justifies treating human beings as disposable. You taught me that, just by surviving, just by refusing to give up hope in that darkness." The memorial site became an important educational destination in Japan. Schools brought students to learn about the dangers of political repression and the importance of civil liberties. The story of the Silent Wing and the mine massacre became part of Japan's national curriculum, a reminder of the dark road that blind nationalism and thought control could lead down. In 1995, on the 50th anniversary of liberation, NHK produced a documentary about the Thought Police program, featuring interviews with surviving prisoners and American soldiers. The documentary won international awards and sparked renewed interest in this lesser-known aspect of World War II history. By then, Dr. Watanabe had passed away at age 98. Hargrove attended his funeral in Tokyo, one of the last surviving American witnesses to the events of 1945. The funeral was attended by hundreds, former patients, students, colleagues, and a surprising number of young people who'd been inspired by his story. He never presented himself as a hero, Watanabe's daughter said during the eulogy. He always said he'd simply been a man trying to survive. But his survival itself was an act of resistance. Every day he lived freely, thought freely, spoke freely. That was a victory over the people who tried to break him. Near the end, when he was very ill, I asked him if he'd forgiven Colonel Nakamura and the others who'd tortured him. He thought about it for a long time before answering. He said, "I don't think about forgiveness. I think about remembering. As long as someone remembers what happened, as long as the story is told, then all that suffering has meaning. The moment we forget is the moment it could happen again." Hargrove returned to the United States after the funeral, carrying with him a gift from Watanabe's family, the physician's personal journal from his time in Sugamo, the one that had survived the decades. The journal's pages were filled with medical observations, poetry, philosophical reflections, and notes about fellow prisoners. On the final page, written in English learned during the occupation years, was a message. "To Captain William Hargrove, who gave me back my life. May you always remember that freedom is fragile, that it must be defended not with weapons, but with vigilance. The greatest threat is always forgetting what it costs. Thank you for not forgetting. Kenji Watanabe, 1994. Hargrove died in 2001 at age 84. His obituary in the local newspaper mentioned his military service, but gave little detail. It was his former students who truly memorialized him. They established a scholarship in his name for students studying human rights and international law. They collected and published the stories he'd told over 25 years of teaching. One former student, who'd become a journalist, wrote an article titled "The Teacher Who Taught Us Why Freedom Matters." In it, she described the day Hargrove had told them about the mine. He'd always been a quiet, reserved man, but that day, telling us about finding those survivors, about 13 people who'd survived 5 days in darkness on nothing but hope, he wept. I'd never seen a teacher cry before. He told us, "Those people taught me something I never learned in any military training. They taught me that the human spirit is stronger than any force that tries to crush it. They taught me that freedom isn't granted by governments. It exists in the human heart, and it can't be taken away, no matter what's done to the body." Then he looked at each of us and said, "You have that freedom. You're sitting in a classroom where you're allowed to read any book, think any thought, question any authority. People died for that. People suffered torture rather than give it up. Don't waste it. Don't take it for granted. Use it. Think hard thoughts. Ask difficult questions. Challenge everything, including me. That's what freedom of thought means." I'm 53 years old now, and I still remember that lesson. I still hear his voice when I'm writing a story that challenges powerful interests. I still remember those 13 survivors in the darkness, refusing to give up hope. That's the gift Captain Hargrove gave us, not just history, but understanding why history matters. Today, the Sugamo site in Tokyo has been redeveloped. The prison was demolished in the 1970s, replaced by modern office buildings. But a small memorial park preserves a section of the original wall, and a museum documents the history of the Thought Police program. Visitors can walk through recreations of the Silent Wing cells, see the files recovered from the records room, and learn about both the perpetrators and victims of political repression. The museum's mission statement, displayed at the entrance, captures the essential lesson. This museum exists to remember what happens when governments fear their own people's thoughts. It documents a time when thinking differently was a crime, when questioning policy was treason, when intellectual freedom was punished with torture and death. We preserve this history not to shame modern Japan, but to remind all people, everywhere, that freedom must be actively defended. Silence enables oppression. Remembering prevents repetition. The mine itself, preserved as a memorial site, receives thousands of visitors each year. Many leave flowers at the memorial plaque. Some leave notes expressing their gratitude for the freedom they enjoy. Japanese school children visiting on field trips often write essays about what they've learned. One such essay, written by a 14-year-old girl in 2019, concluded, "I used to think freedom of speech meant I could say whatever I wanted without getting in trouble. But after visiting the mine and learning about the people who died for thinking differently, I understand freedom is more serious than that. It means I have a responsibility to think carefully, to question things that seem wrong, to speak up even when it's scary. The people who died in that mine didn't die so I could say careless things. They died so I could think deeply and speak truthfully. I won't waste their sacrifice." The story of the Silent Wing and the mine massacre remains a powerful reminder of a truth that every generation must learn. Freedom isn't natural or inevitable. It's fragile. It requires eternal vigilance. And the greatest threats often come not from foreign enemies, but from domestic forces that fear the free exchange of ideas. Captain Hargrove understood that truth on September 2, 1945, when he walked into Sugamo Prison looking for an administrative task and found evidence of systematic thought suppression. Dr. Watanabe understood it during 1,247 days of isolation when he kept himself sane by refusing to let them destroy his mind. The 13 survivors understood it during 5 days in absolute darkness when hope was the only thing that kept them alive. They all understood what is easy to forget in times of peace and prosperity, that the right to think freely, to question authority, to hold opinions that differ from official policy, these aren't luxuries. They're the foundation of human dignity, and they're worth any sacrifice to preserve. Up next, you've got 2 more standout stories right on your screen. If this one hit the mark, you won't want to pass these up. Just click and check them out. And don't forget to subscribe and turn on the notification bell so you don't miss any upload from us.